There's a particular kind of silence that lives in old houses, not emptiness, presence. The accumulated weight of decades pressed into floorboards, absorbed into walls, settled into the very bones of a structure that has witnessed births and deaths and everything ordinary in between. Our family home had that silence, a Victorian on Maple Street, built in 1892 with original crown moldings, and a wraparound porch that creaked in exactly the same places it had creaked when my grandmother was a girl. 3 stories of history, 4 generations of memories, 1 brother who saw nothing but dollar signs and powder. I'm Vivian, I'm 53 years old, and 6 months ago, I watched my brother sell our childhood home to feed a habit he'd been hiding for 15 years. Sell it to a development company that, as it turned out, belonged to my husband's law firm. The universe has a dark sense of humor, but sometimes, if you're patient enough, that humor turns in your favor. Let me tell you how a house became a weapon, how betrayal revealed itself in triplicate, and how I learned that the people who underestimate you are handing you the sharpest knife in the drawer. My brother Daniel is 4 years younger than me, 53 and 49, old enough to know better, old enough, apparently, to have been fooling everyone for nearly 2 decades. Growing up, Daniel was the golden child. I don't say that with bitterness, it was simply fact. He had the easy charm, the quick smile, the ability to make our parents laugh when I could only make them proud. I was the responsible one, the one who came home on time, who got the scholarships, who called every Sunday without fail. Daniel was the one who disappeared for weeks and returned with wild stories, who borrowed money and forgot to repay it, who drifted through jobs and relationships with the same careless grace. Our mother loved us both, but she understood Daniel in a way she never quite understood me. Perhaps because they were alike, dreamers, both of them, people who believed the world would always catch them when they fell. Our father was practical, a carpenter who built furniture in the basement workshop, who measured twice and cut once, who believed in the honest weight of things you could hold in your hands. He left me his tools. He left Daniel the house. That was the beginning of everything. The will was straightforward. The house went to Daniel, with the stipulation that I would always have the right to live there if I chose. The workshop contents came to me, along with a modest investment account. At the time, 13 years ago, it seemed fair. I was married to Richard, established in my career as a financial auditor, living in a comfortable colonial across town. Daniel was between jobs, between apartments, between whatever it was he was always between. The house was meant to anchor him. Instead, it became the thing he could sell. I didn't know about the drugs. I want to be clear about that. 15 years of secret addiction, and I never saw it. Maybe I didn't want to see it. Maybe I was too busy with my own life, the promotions, the marriage that looked perfect from the outside, the careful construction of a world where everything had its place. Daniel's chaos was something I'd learned to manage from a distance. Alone here, a bailed-out situation there. I told myself he was finding his way. I told myself he would figure it out. I told myself a lot of things. The first sign of trouble came in February, a Tuesday, unremarkable except for the cold that had settled over the city like a held breath. I received a call from Margaret Chen, the elderly woman who'd lived next door to the family home for 40 years. "Vivian, dear," she said, and something in her voice made me set down my coffee. "There are men at your parents' house, with clipboards, measuring things." I called Daniel. The phone rang 6 times before he answered, his voice thick with something I chose to interpret as sleep. "It's nothing," he said. "Just getting some estimates. The roof needs work." "What kind of estimates require measuring the yard?" "Relax, Viv. I've got it handled." He didn't have anything handled. What he had was a heroin habit that cost $2,000 a week and a deal already signed with Meridian Development Partners to sell the property for $400,000. Well below market value, structured for a quick close, cash offer, no inspection contingencies. I learned all of this later. At the time, I accepted his explanation and returned to my spreadsheets. My orderly columns of numbers that always balanced if you just looked hard enough. 3 weeks later, Margaret called again. There was a dumpster in the driveway, workers carrying boxes out of the house. She'd seen Daniel directing traffic, looking thin, looking wrong. This time, I drove over. The house was being gutted, not renovated, gutted. My grandmother's china cabinet carried out like trash. The dining room table where we'd had every Thanksgiving until I was 30, stacked against the porch railing with a free sign. My father's hand-built bookshelves, already torn from the walls, the plaster scarred where they'd been anchored for 60 years. Daniel stood in the middle of the destruction, his hands shoved in his pockets, watching me with an expression I'd never seen before. Defiance mixed with something that might have been fear. "What are you doing?" My voice came out calmer than I felt. "Daniel, what is this?" "It's my house," he said. "I can do what I want with it. The will gave you the house. It didn't erase 130 years of family history. History doesn't pay bills, Vivian." He scratched at his arm, a nervous gesture I now recognized as something else entirely. "I need the money. I've needed it for a while." "For what? What could possibly justify this?" He didn't answer. He just looked at me with those hollow eyes, and I understood, in a single, terrible moment, that my brother had become a stranger. That perhaps he'd been a stranger for years, and I'd simply refused to acknowledge the evidence in front of me. "It's already done," he said. "I signed the papers last week. The sale closes in 45 days. You can't. The will says I have the right to live here. You can't sell without my consent." "Actually, I can," he smiled. And there was nothing golden about it anymore. I had a lawyer look at it. "Your right to residency is subordinate to ownership. If I sell, your right transfers to the new owner's discretion. And they've made their discretion very clear." "Who?" I demanded. "Who buys a historic home just to demolish it?" "Meridian Development Partners. They're putting up townhouses. 6 units, I think. Maybe 8. Meridian. The name landed in my chest like a stone. I knew Meridian. Not well, but well enough. Richard's law firm had done work for them. Development deals, zoning disputes. The kind of real estate maneuvering that turned neighborhoods into investments and investments into profits. I'd seen the name on documents Richard left on his desk. I'd heard him mention it in phone calls he thought I wasn't listening to. My husband's firm, my brother's buyer. I didn't say anything. I just stood there in the ruins of my childhood, watching my brother shift his weight from foot to foot, and I let the understanding settle into my bones. This was not coincidence. Nothing about this was coincidence. I drove home in silence. No radio, no phone calls, just the sound of my own breathing and the questions multiplying in my mind like cells dividing. Richard was in his office when I arrived, the home office with the mahogany desk and the law books he'd never actually read, the ones that existed purely for atmosphere. He looked up with the smile he'd been giving me for 24 years, warm, attentive, utterly practiced. "You're home early," he said. "I went to see Daniel." The smile flickered. Just for a moment, just a shadow passing across his face, but I saw it. I was an auditor. I noticed discrepancies. "How's he doing?" "He sold the house." I watched Richard's hands resting on his desk. They didn't move. "To Meridian Development Partners." Nothing. No reaction. No surprise. "That's unfortunate," he said, his voice perfectly calibrated to sympathy. "I know how much that place meant to you. Your firm represents Meridian, among others. It's a large firm, Vivian. I don't handle every account. But you knew about this deal." He paused, considered, made a decision. "I heard something about it. I didn't realize it was your family's property until recently. By then, the deal was already in progress. I couldn't interfere without creating conflicts." "Conflicts?" I repeated the word like I was tasting it. "My brother is selling our family home for drug money, and you were worried about conflicts." Richard's expression shifted. The sympathy drained away, replaced by something colder, something truer. "What do you want me to say? Daniel's choices aren't my responsibility. Neither are yours, frankly. The house was his to sell. He sold it. That's the end of the story. But it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. I spent that night in the guest room, telling myself it was because I needed space to think. The truth was simpler. I couldn't sleep next to a man I no longer recognized. Or perhaps a man I was finally seeing clearly for the first time. I made lists. I always made lists when the world felt unstable. Facts in columns, questions in margins, patterns waiting to emerge. Fact: Daniel sold the house for $400,000. Fact: the market value, even in its current condition, was at least $650,000. Fact: Meridian was known for aggressive acquisition tactics. Fact: Richard's firm had represented Meridian for 6 years. Question: how did Meridian know Daniel was vulnerable? Question: why would they offer below market value unless they knew he was desperate? Question: what did Richard know, and when did he know it? I'm an auditor. I follow the numbers. And the numbers here were telling me a story I didn't want to believe but couldn't ignore. The next morning, I called in sick to work, something I hadn't done in 11 years, and began my investigation. First, I accessed the public records for Meridian's recent acquisitions. A development company leaves a paper trail like breadcrumbs through a forest, and I'd spent 30 years learning to follow breadcrumbs. Over the past 3 years, they'd purchased 14 properties in a concentrated area, all within a 12-block radius, all below market value, all from sellers with documented financial problems, bankruptcies, divorces, foreclosures, tax liens. Someone was feeding them information, someone who knew which homeowners were vulnerable. Second, I examined the ownership structure. Meridian Development Partners was a subsidiary of Coastal Holdings, which was owned by a trust managed by yet another entity. Shell companies nested inside shell companies, the kind of structure designed to obscure beneficial ownership. But I knew how to read these structures. It was literally my job. The trail ended at a name I recognized, Warren Doyle. Warren was Richard's senior partner, the man who'd hired him 22 years ago, who'd groomed him for partnership, who'd been coming to our dinner parties since before we could afford good wine. Warren, who always complimented my cooking and asked about my family and looked at me like I was furniture. I sat back in my chair, the implications spreading through my mind like cracks in ice. Richard didn't just know about the deal. He was part of a pattern, a system designed to identify vulnerable properties and acquire them for below market value, funneling profits to partners hidden behind corporate structures. And my brother, my foolish, addicted, golden brother, had been their latest mark. I didn't confront Richard, not yet. Confrontation was what they expected. The dramatic revelation, the tearful accusations, the eventual settlement where I walked away with just enough to feel like I'd won something. I'd seen it happen to other wives in our circle. I'd watched them accept their portions and disappear into quieter lives, their silence purchased along with their dignity. I wasn't interested in portions. I wasn't interested in quiet. I was interested in everything. For the next 3 months, I became two people. The surface Vivian continued her routines, work, dinners, the occasional social function where I smiled at Warren Doyle and asked about his golf game. The other Vivian worked in the margins, gathering documents, building files, cultivating the kind of patience that burns cold and steady. I started with Daniel, not to save him, he was beyond saving, at least by me, but to understand how they'd found him. It turned out to be embarrassingly simple. Daniel had used Richard's contacts to find treatment programs 2 years ago, during one of his periodic attempts at sobriety. The records were supposed to be confidential, but somehow Meridian had known exactly when he was most desperate, exactly when the house would be most attainable. Richard had sold my brother's vulnerability to his partners, my brother's addiction, my family's home, my childhood, all converted into line items on a development proposal. I found the emails in Richard's cloud backup. He'd been careless, assuming I'd never think to look, assuming I was too trusting or too stupid or too wifely to question him. There they were, discussions of the Maple Street property, references to the sisters' potential interference, plans to accelerate the timeline once Daniel's latest treatment failed. They'd been watching us, waiting for my brother to break, helping him break in ways I was still uncovering. The money trail was even more damning. Through a series of transactions I had to trace 3 times to believe, I discovered that Richard had personally profited $175,000 from the Maple Street deal. Not through his partnership, through a separate entity, another shell company, another layer of obscured ownership. My husband had made $175,000 destroying my family's legacy. I documented everything: screenshots, bank records, corporate filings, email chains. I organized it the way I organized my audits, chronologically, thematically, with cross-references and supporting evidence. A case so thorough that any investigator could follow it blindfolded. And then I found something else. The pattern I'd identified, vulnerable homeowners targeted for below-market purchases, wasn't just ethically questionable, it was illegal. Specifically, it involved material misrepresentation to mortgage holders, fraudulent documentation submitted to municipal authorities, and what appeared to be systematic violations of fair housing regulations. Warren Doyle hadn't just been greedy, he'd been criminal. And Richard, by participating in the scheme, had made himself complicit. I had everything I needed. The question was how to use it. The easy path would have been to take my evidence to the authorities and let the system handle the rest. Divorce Richard, watch the firm collapse, collect whatever settlement the courts deemed appropriate. But the easy path had some problems. First, criminal investigations took time. Years, sometimes. Warren had resources for expensive lawyers and delaying tactics. Richard would have time to hide assets, to construct defenses, to paint me as a bitter wife with an axe to grind. Second, I'd learned enough about the legal system to know that justice was distributed unevenly. White-collar crime rarely resulted in meaningful consequences for men like Warren. A fine, perhaps, a consent decree. Slaps on wrists that barely stung. Third, and this was the part that surprised me, I discovered I wanted more than justice. I wanted them to lose. Not abstractly, not eventually, but personally and completely. I wanted them to feel what Daniel had felt when he signed away our home. What I had felt standing in those gutted rooms, watching our history carried out like garbage. I wanted them to understand, so I devised a different approach. The first thing I did was contact Hannah Morrison, a journalist at the city's largest newspaper who specialized in development scandals and political corruption. We'd crossed paths years ago during an investigation into municipal contract fraud, and I'd been impressed by her tenacity and her ethics. I laid out the broad strokes of what I'd found: the predatory acquisitions, the shell companies, the potential fraud, without revealing my personal connection. She was interested but cautious. She needed documentation, multiple sources, confirmation that wouldn't expose her or the paper to litigation. I can get you documentation, I told her, but I need something in return. What? Time. I need you to hold the story until I give you the signal. She considered this. How long? 6 weeks, maybe less. And what happens in those 6 weeks? I smiled, though she couldn't see it. A development deal falls apart, publicly, spectacularly. The second thing I did was contact the State Bar Association, not to file a complaint, not yet, but to understand the procedures, the timelines, the consequences. I wanted to know exactly what would happen when the documentation reached the right desks, and I wanted to know when it would happen. The third thing I did was hire a forensic accountant, not for the evidence I already had, but for the evidence I suspected was still hidden. If Richard had profited once from this scheme, he'd profited before. And if he'd hidden assets once, he'd hidden them throughout our marriage. I was right, of course. The accountant found 3 separate accounts I hadn't known existed, totaling nearly $700,000 in concealed assets. Money that, under state law, I was entitled to half of. Money that, more importantly, Richard had illegally hidden during our marriage, a separate crime, a separate leverage point. The fourth thing I did was contact Daniel. This was harder. My brother had become someone I didn't recognize, someone whose choices had caused damage I wasn't sure I could forgive. But he was still my brother, and he was still a victim, even if he'd made himself an easy target. I found him at a treatment facility outside the city, 2 weeks into another attempt at sobriety. He looked terrible, thin, shaky, his golden charm corroded into something desperate and gray. But his eyes were clear, and when I told him what I'd discovered, those eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in years. Rage. Pure, clarifying rage. They knew, he said. They knew I was using. They waited for me to get bad enough. Yes. And Richard, his voice cracked. Richard was part of it? Yes. Daniel was silent for a long time. Then he looked at me with an expression I remembered from childhood, from before the addiction, from when he was still the golden boy who believed the world was fundamentally fair. What do you need me to do? I need you to get better, I said. I need you clean and coherent and ready to tell your story when the time comes. Can you do that? For you? For you. For our parents. For the house they trusted you to protect. He nodded, and for the first time in 15 years, I believed he meant it. The plan came together piece by piece, each element positioned like stones in a mosaic. I worked in the margins of my life, maintaining the surface routine while building the architecture of consequence beneath it. Richard noticed nothing. He was too busy congratulating himself on the Meridian success, too occupied with the new deals his partnership with Warren was generating. He'd grown complacent in our marriage, assuming that 2 decades of performed contentment meant actual contentment, assuming that my silence was satisfaction rather than strategy. I let him assume. I smiled at the right moments, asked the right questions, played the role of supportive spouse with the same precision I brought to my audits. Every dinner, every social function, every night I spent in the guest room because of my insomnia. All of it was theater, and I was giving the performance of my life. The turning point came at the end of April. Meridian was finalizing plans for the Maple Street development, the townhouses that would replace my family's home. They needed zoning approval, environmental clearances, a series of bureaucratic stamps that would transform destruction into progress. This was where my planning intersected with their ambition. Through channels I'd carefully cultivated, I ensured that certain documents found their way to certain desks. The fraudulent environmental assessments, the misrepresented property values, the undisclosed beneficial ownership that violated city transparency ordinances. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would trigger immediate suspicion, just enough irregularity to require review. The city's development commission scheduled a hearing. Routine, they called it. Standard due diligence. Warren Doyle wasn't concerned. He'd navigated these waters before, knew which palms to grease and which questions to deflect. But he didn't know about Hannah Morrison, sitting in the back row of that hearing, recording every word. He didn't know about the anonymous tip that had reached the state attorney general's office, prompting a parallel investigation. He didn't know that his careful structure of shell companies was being disassembled by forensic accountants who worked for the government, not for him. He especially didn't know about my brother, Daniel testified at the hearing. Clean for 6 weeks, clear-eyed and trembling with the effort of standing upright, he told his story. Not just the addiction, the approach, the friend who'd suggested Meridian as a buyer, the pressure to close quickly, to accept the first offer, to sign documents he barely read. The way his vulnerability had been exploited with surgical precision. I watched from the gallery as the commission members' expressions shifted. Warren's expensive lawyers objected, demanded recesses, tried to discredit Daniel's testimony, but the documents supported everything he said. The timeline matched. The evidence was irrefutable. The Meridian development project was suspended pending investigation. That night, Richard came home late. His face was gray, his movements jerky with barely controlled panic. He poured himself a drink, his third, based on the tremor in his hands, and stood in the living room staring at nothing. "You heard," I said from the doorway. He turned, looked at me, and for the first time in our marriage, I saw him actually see me. "You knew," he said. "You knew and you didn't warn me. I knew that your firm helped destroy my family's home. I knew you profited from my brother's addiction. I knew you hid money from me for years while I built a life around your lies. Vivian, I'm not finished." I stepped into the room, keeping my voice level. "I also know about Coastal Holdings, about Warren's arrangement with the assessor's office, about the 17 other properties acquired through the same fraudulent methods." His glass shattered against the hardwood. He hadn't thrown it. His grip had simply failed. "That's not, you can't prove, I've already proven it. The documentation is with the Attorney General's office. It's with the State Bar. It's with a journalist who's been waiting very patiently for the right moment to publish." Richard sat down heavily, missing the chair by inches, catching himself on the arm at the last moment. He looked in that moment exactly like what he was, a small man who had mistaken cruelty for cleverness, who had built his success on the suffering of people he considered beneath him. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want you to understand something." I crouched so we were at eye level, so he could see exactly who he was dealing with. "I spent 24 years being the wife you thought you married, supportive, quiet, unquestioning. Do you know why?" He shook his head. "Because I believed in the life we were building. I believed in you. And when I discovered that everything was a lie, I didn't collapse. I didn't rage. I did what I've always done. I followed the numbers. I built a case. I found the discrepancies. Vivian, please." "The difference is, this time, the audit was personal." I stood. "Your assets are frozen as of this morning. The hidden accounts, the partnership shares, the investment properties you thought I didn't know about. All of it. My lawyer filed the motion at 9 a.m. "You can't." "I can. I did. And Richard." I moved toward the door, then paused. "The story breaks tomorrow. Every paper, every news site, every legal blog in the state. By this time next week, you won't be a partner anymore. You won't be a lawyer. You'll be a defendant." I left him sitting there, surrounded by the ruins of his certainties, and I felt nothing. Not triumph, not vindication, just clarity. The world burned brightly that spring. Hannah's story ran on the front page, continued for 3 days, sparked investigations at the state and federal level. Warren Doyle was arrested on a Tuesday afternoon. Perp walked in front of cameras that broadcast his shame across every screen in the city. 11 other members of the firm faced charges ranging from fraud to conspiracy to RICO violations. The house that Warren built came down around him, and everyone inside felt the collapse. Richard wasn't arrested, but the bar suspended his license pending investigation. The divorce proceedings were swift. With his assets frozen and his leverage evaporated, he had nothing left to negotiate with. The settlement gave me everything I was entitled to and more. Compensation for the years of hidden accounts, for the breach of fiduciary duty that marriage apparently still represented in some legal contexts. I used part of that money to buy back the Maple Street property. Meridian, in its death throes, was liquidating assets. The Maple Street project, suspended and controversial, was worth less to them than the paper the contracts were printed on. I made an offer through an anonymous LLC, a taste of their own medicine, and they accepted without negotiation. The house was mine again, damaged, gutted, stripped of most of what had made it precious. But mine. I spent the summer rebuilding, not the house. That would take years, and I wasn't sure I wanted to restore it to what it had been. The past was gone. Trying to recreate it would be another form of denial. Instead, I hired architects who understood preservation, who could honor the bones of the building while making it something new. Daniel helped when he could. He was fragile still, early in a recovery that would take years, but he showed up. Sanded floors, painted walls, learned to use our father's tools in the workshop I'd converted into a studio space. We didn't talk much about what had happened. The wound was too fresh, the betrayal too deep. But we worked side by side, and sometimes that was enough. The house reopened in October, not as a family home. I couldn't live there anymore, not with all those ghosts, but as something else, a community space, a place for recovery meetings, for support groups, for the kinds of programs that might have helped Daniel if anyone had noticed he needed help. I named it the Morrison House, after my grandmother, a woman who had raised 2 children in those rooms, who had weathered the Depression and a world war, and a husband who drank too much, who had died believing that her legacy would endure. She was right. It just took a while. There's a particular kind of silence that lives in old houses. I understand it differently now. Not emptiness, not presence, something in between. The accumulated weight of everything that's been survived. I visit the Morrison house weekly, though I don't live there. I have a small apartment downtown, clean lines and large windows, and nothing that reminds me of any of my former lives. I work still, not as an auditor, but as a consultant for nonprofits, helping them build the kind of transparent structures that prevent the corruptions I've seen. Richard sends letters sometimes, from the facility where he's completing his court-ordered treatment, from the modest apartment where he's rebuilding whatever life he can construct from the wreckage. He wants forgiveness. He wants to explain. He wants me to understand that he didn't mean for any of it to happen the way it did. I don't read the letters. I don't burn them either. I just let them accumulate in a drawer, evidence of a man still trying to construct narratives that cast him as something other than what he is. Daniel is 11 months sober. He leads a meeting at the Morrison house on Thursday evenings, tells his story to rooms full of people who are still deciding whether to believe recovery is possible. He's not golden anymore. The charm is gone, replaced by something rawer, something earned. I think our parents would be proud of who he's becoming. I think they'd be proud of both of us. Warren Doyle pleaded guilty to 12 counts of fraud and conspiracy. He'll serve 4 to 7 years, which isn't enough but is more than men like him usually face. The firm dissolved. The partners scattered. The empire built on other people's desperation crumbled into cautionary tale. I don't think about revenge anymore. That's the strange thing about achieving it. Once the satisfaction fades, you realize it was never really about punishment. It was about truth, about making the hidden visible, the protected accountable, the quiet finally loud enough to matter. Last week, I walked through the Morrison house after a meeting had ended. The chairs were still arranged in a circle, the coffee pot still warm, the air still heavy with the particular vulnerability of people trying to save themselves. I stopped in what used to be the dining room, where my grandmother's china cabinet once stood. The space is different now, a reading nook with comfortable chairs and windows that let in the evening light. But the floorboards are the same ones I walked on as a child. The walls remember, even if they've been repainted. A woman I didn't recognize was sitting in one of the chairs, staring at her hands. She looked up when I entered, and her expression held all the uncertainty of someone at the beginning of something terrible and necessary. "Are you the founder?" she asked. "I'm the renovator," I said. "This house has had a lot of founders." She smiled, uncertain. "Does it get easier?" "Yes," I told her, and I meant it. Not quickly, not cleanly, but yes. I sat with her for a while, 2 strangers in a room full of ghosts, and I thought about all the ways we rebuild ourselves from the wreckage others leave behind. The slow work of it, the patience required. There's a particular kind of silence that follows survival, not emptiness, presence. The accumulated weight of everything you've learned, pressed into the bones of who you've become. I carry that silence with me now, not as burden, as foundation. Some people say revenge changes you. They're wrong. It reveals you. And what it revealed in me was this. I am not the woman who was betrayed. I am not the wife who was fooled. I am not the sister who failed to see. I am the one who followed the numbers, the one who built the case, the one who understood that patience is just rage with a plan, and silence is just power waiting for its moment. The house on Maple Street stands again, different and the same, sheltering strangers who are becoming survivors. I didn't save it, I transformed it. And in the transforming, I finally became myself. Finally became myself. Finally became myself. Finally became